It's such a pleasure for me to be here today with you all. I see some familiar faces, as some of you were at Josh's speech last night at the Haggerty Center with the International Affairs Forum. He was a great warm-up act for me. In all seriousness, if you missed his event, I believe the whole thing is going to be posted online. He gives a really outstanding and concise summary of the state of the world, but I will say that if you're going to watch it, it is pretty sobering stuff, so I recommend that you are not. Best enjoyed with a stiff drink. I'm here today to tell you about what I learned from some incredible breast cancer survivors, about how our vulnerabilities can make us better leaders. But first I thought I'd say a few words about myself and how I came to write my book, which, as you heard, is called Beat Breast Cancer Like a Boss. As you may have heard, I'm a producer and correspondent with the PBS NewsHour. I'm originally from New Jersey, and I went to college at New York University, and I moved to DC right after school. I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. Yeah, let me turn that off. I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, and I was drawn to Washington's political and international scenes. I began my career in 2009 as a researcher in the NBC News political unit. My first boss was Chuck Todd, who's now the host of Meet the Press. I spent a while at NBC covering the early years of the Obama administration, and I got to ride on Air Force One more times than I can count. After 5 years at NBC, I moved to ABC News. I was a State Department producer. I was a radio reporter, grilling the White House press secretary from the ABC News radio seat in the back of the room. And I was a Capitol Hill producer. Finally, I moved to my current home with the PBS NewsHour in 2019 as a foreign affairs producer. And for those of you who watch the PBS NewsHour, thank you so much for being viewers like you. Throughout all of these many behind-the-scenes jobs, I had a desire and ambition to move to the front of the camera and become a correspondent. It took me 12 years, but I finally made that leap this year as a hybrid. I spend about half my time now producing stories and the other half reporting them in front of the camera. So that's my professional story. In terms of me personally, the first thing I will tell you about myself is that I am incredibly lucky. And much of my early fortune in life was by accident of birth. My mom is a retired history teacher, and as you heard, my dad is the drummer for Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. He also spent 15 years as the band leader on Late Night with Conan O'Brien. I got to meet all kinds of celebrities and travel around the world. You could say I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I actually received one of those as a gift from Sir Ringo Starr when I was born. But there was one genetic gift that I could have done without, a mutation on my BRCA1 gene, which increases a woman's lifetime risk of breast cancer to around 80%, and ovarian cancer, somewhere within the 60% range. There are actually a lot of genetic mutations that increase the risk of all kinds of cancers. BRCA is one of them. It's better known because you may have heard back in 2013, Angelina Jolie wrote an op-ed in which she shared that she also had the BRCA mutation and she was undergoing prophylactic surgery to reduce her risk. My BRCA experience started a few years before she went public with hers, so I like to think of myself as a genetic cancer trendsetter. When I was in college, my parents shared with me that my dad was a BRCA1 carrier. Yes, it can come from either parent. He had been tested many years prior. His sister, my aunt, was undergoing a difficult battle with ovarian cancer at the time. My parents believed, sorry, my printer must have had a little hiccup. My parents believed that when I was a college junior, I was old enough to take that information and make a sound decision with what to do with it. It didn't take me long to decide that I wanted to get tested to see if I was also a carrier of the BRCA gene, at which point I could explore my options for dealing with it. To me, knowledge is always power. So shortly after I decided to get tested, I got the results and I found out that I was BRCA positive. That was a scary moment. And it was made scarier by the fact that I didn't know where to turn next. As I mentioned, it was years before people became familiar with what has become known colloquially as the Angelina Jolie gene, where people kind of stopped questioning the decisions of a 20-year-old girl who might want to remove her breasts because she didn't want to get breast cancer. So at the time, the genetic counselor that went over my BRCA results with me told me that my only real option was to start getting mammograms and MRIs every 6 months in order to keep a close eye on my breast health. She didn't even mention the option of preventative surgery, like mastectomy. The idea of going in and out of doctor's appointments every 6 months indefinitely until what? They found a lump? That sounded awful to me. I didn't want to spend the next however many years basically waiting for cancer to catch up with me. I felt helpless when I wanted to be proactive. Thankfully, I sought a second opinion from a surgical oncologist. She told me that more and more young BRCA-positive women were choosing to undergo risk-reducing preventative mastectomies and reconstructive surgeries. She even introduced me to one of her patients. We had lunch, and she flashed me in the bathroom to show off her results. They and she looked amazing. As soon as I understood mastectomy was an option, the clouds lifted. I was so relieved that there was an alternative that satisfied my desire to be proactive about my health. It didn't take me long to find a surgical team and schedule my procedures, and I ended up doing them over the spring break of my senior year, which always makes me chuckle. Some girls are busy flashing their boobs. I was getting mine removed. I will say, however, that one benefit of having reconstructive breast surgery is you can pick your size. So I ended up going a little bigger than what I had originally been endowed with. I like to think of it as a silver lining. Now, more than a decade later, having my preventative surgeries remains one of the best decisions I ever made, besides marrying Josh. I always felt, though, that my journey would have been so much more pleasant and less scary from the very beginning if I had known more from the start about all the options that I had. If only I had a collection of girlfriends, 30 of those bathroom flashing buddies, to help me work through this decision. Well, I decided that the next best thing to having 30 of those real-life breast buddies would be to create a virtual community of breast cancer warriors, which is how I ended up interviewing 30 incredible women for my book, Beat Breast Cancer Like a Boss. Some of the women in the book are previvors, like myself, that's what we call ourselves, and some of them the rest of them span the whole breast cancer spectrum from stage 0 to stage 4 and to 1 or more recurrences. No one who picks up this book will have gone through all of the same experiences as any one of this person, but I can guarantee that there's at least one element of every story that will resonate with anyone who's had to deal with breast cancer, any type of cancer, and frankly, any other kind of health challenge. And while I wrote this book to feel like a casual exchange with friends, the women featured are all incredibly accomplished in their professional lives. Among them are Grammy-winning recording artist Sheryl Crow, Olympic gold medalist Keegan Randall, and Emmy-nominated journalist Athena Jones. So I figured they'd have some useful advice for how to get through health challenges, in this case specifically breast cancer, but again, it really can be applied to any health or other challenge that you might face. One common thread I found was that so many of these women in leadership, the bosses of the book's title, were faced with decisions over how vulnerable and candid to be in front of the men and the women that they lead. Of course, it's hard enough existing in the professional world as a woman. Even as far as we've come over the decades, we're still expected to show no fear or vulnerability, lest we get written off as emotional or bitchy. It's unfair, but it's a reality of being a woman in the workplace, even today. So you might think that some of the women I profiled in this book would shy away from that vulnerability, that they might try to conceal some of their challenges. And some certainly did, at least at first. But what surprised me was how ultimately they all embraced the idea that sharing their health struggles and the fears surrounding them would change their leadership style for the better and help them build even stronger relationships with their employees, clients, and their bosses. Here are a few of my favorite examples. For anyone who's into gymnastics, you probably know the legendary UCLA coach Valerie Kondos Field. She led the Bruins gymnastics team for almost 3 decades, bringing them to 7 national championships and 19 Pac-12 conference championships. She's also shaped the careers of many gymnasts who went on to be Olympians. Miss Val, as everyone calls her, told me she always prided herself on being the kind of coach who actually didn't lead by example. She was a trained dancer. She wasn't a gymnast. She had never done a gymnastics routine in her life. But rather, she led by asking questions. If someone had a subpar routine, Valerie would ask what was going through their mind, how they were feeling when they did this vault or that jump. And the same went for successful routines. She and the gymnast would engage in a conversation to try to establish a pattern in order to repeat that same success the next time. She said that once she motivated her athletes to embrace the why, they could start talking about the how. Valerie built her legacy on kindness, communication, and empathy with her team. But she also had a practice of, as she put it, bringing a little anxiety to competitions. She would physically present herself as tense in order to convey a sense of being hyper-focused, which she believed would rub off on her team. The warm and bubbly Miss Val from practices would disappear, replaced with someone who was trying to exude a sense of removal from the team in order to make clear the hierarchy and let the girls know that now was the time to do battle. But then she was diagnosed in 2015 with stage 1 HER2-positive breast cancer. Even though she was close with her team, she also relished her independence and her privacy. In fact, she didn't want anyone going to her chemotherapy sessions with her. That was her time for herself. And she wanted to keep her athletes focused on their sport and their craft, not on her health. It was a part of Valerie's inner life that at first she wanted to keep separate from her persona as Miss Val. So she could have chosen to set strict boundaries with her gymnasts. But when she went to see them all for the first time after revealing her diagnosis, she saw fear and concern in their eyes. She realized they were more scared of the cancer and what it might do to her than she was. So she decided to be completely transparent with them and treated that meeting as a teachable moment. She actually invited each girl to come up and feel her tumor. This one didn't feel like a lump, it felt like a pulled muscle. And even as she joked that she heard HR sirens going off in the background, she found that allowing the gymnast to physically engage with her cancer in that way, in that moment, helped demystify it. One athlete told her, "From the minute you told me you had cancer, this big, bold print idea of cancer was in my brain. And after we talked about it, and after I felt it, it was like cancer with a small c. It wasn't as scary anymore." Now, of course, in most professional settings, it would be highly ill-advised to encourage a group of subordinates to touch your breast or anywhere else on your body. But while it may be an extreme case, it does show how sharing your vulnerability, rather than hiding it, can bring you closer to the team that you lead, whether your workplace is a balance beam or a cubicle. And because Miss Val had been so candid, her team realized that they could continue to just be themselves around her. They didn't need to dance around the topic of cancer, but they also didn't feel like Valerie was hiding anything from them. So maybe once in a while a teammate would ask how she was doing or whether she wanted a cup of coffee, but it was never obsequious. It was never overwrought, which is exactly how she wanted to be treated. And once she explored the why with her team, she was able to get to the how. Valerie's breast cancer experience also transformed the energy she brought to competitions. Instead of asserting a sense of seriousness and anxiety, she started dancing on the sidelines every time one of her athletes was up. After all, she was a dancer by training, and is the kind of person who dances in the supermarket aisle if there's a good song on. That was her real personality. She didn't feel the need to put up a front anymore at competitions, and it rubbed off on her team. After the first such meet, one gymnast came up to her and said, "I've never enjoyed a competition so much. You were so much fun, and it allowed me not to stress out." Again, this anecdote might not be the most relatable, given that most of us in this room are not professional athletes or coaches, but it does go to show that whatever discipline you're in, if you let your guard down sometimes, if you invite people to see the real you and your team might both feel more comfortable, and that will likely lead to better results for everyone. Now, everyone I'm talking about today did embrace a certain measure of vulnerability, but of course the journey was different for every person. Now we'll talk about Kathy Matsui. She's the vice chair of Goldman Sachs Japan. Not exactly a warm and fuzzy sort of environment, especially for a woman, especially in the early aughts. Kathy always had to be extremely tough in the workplace. Weakness was deadly. So when she was diagnosed in 2001, she set some strong boundaries around herself. She took a leave of absence and pursued treatment in her home state of California. She told only her closest colleagues and clients in Tokyo about the cancer. She informed others simply that she was going on leave, which frankly at the time was very common in that kind of workplace. But when she returned to work, she knew she'd face questions. She was already one of the only senior women in the office, and now she was coming back wearing a very obvious wig, having lost her hair during chemo. So she started to open up, talking about her experience in small groups with teammates and clients. And she started talking about it in the media, which in Japan, at least 20 years ago, was highly unusual. Soon she started receiving emails and phone calls from clients and colleagues she didn't know very well. They'd confide in her, telling her that they'd been diagnosed with cancer or their spouse had been. She realized that sharing her vulnerability made her much more accessible. Beyond being able to help people by commiserating, it also made her more relatable, which only helped her business. As she put it, quote, "Oftentimes we look at senior people at companies and think, wow, they've just had this nonstop upward trajectory in their lives, professionally and personally." But she says she didn't know anyone for whom that was actually the case. Everybody has challenges. And when you're open about yours, especially when you're in a position of leadership, it can be scary, but it can also be a vehicle for camaraderie and candor, which are both good for business. And that brings me to my last breast cancer business boss, Mary Powell, who served as the CEO of Green Mountain Power, a Vermont energy utility, from 2008 to 2020. Mary always prided herself on fostering a collegial working environment. The office had an open floor plan, and her standing desk was right next to the lineman. She believed in cutting out bureaucracy. To that end, she'd invite all of her 500 employees to a weekly morning conference call, where she'd come on and talk about big picture things like metrics, and oftentimes leaders addressing their entire company might be a little guarded in what they say and how they say it, because they might be unsure of how it could get construed or maybe leak out. But Mary thrived on transparency. So in 2015, when she tested positive for a different breast cancer mutation, this one's called the NBN gene, of course, she shared it with her company on the next Monday morning conference call. She also shared with all 500 employees that she was planning on having a preventative double mastectomy with reconstructive surgery. That call was daunting for Mary, but she had another one in front of her that was even harder. Before her surgery, she had a biopsy which found that she actually had very early stage breast cancer, which meant her surgery wasn't prophylactic at all. Understandably, she was brought to tears on that call, shaken by the sheer magnitude of what she had learned and the idea that the cancer had already been growing inside of her when she tested positive for the gene. But both conference calls created all sorts of positive connections throughout her office. She recalled one particularly tough, burly lineman who confided in her that he himself had battled breast cancer. That's a kind of understanding that can only come through shared experience. In a workplace with so many different people from so many walks of life, that sort of understanding is priceless. As Mary put it, quote, "I don't know if folks think we're supposed to be superhuman, but somehow when you bear your humanity, it has very encouraging impacts on other people." I couldn't agree more. The stories that Valerie, Kathy, Mary, and the other 27 women profiled in my book shared have only strengthened my belief that sharing our adversity can make us stronger and help those around us. It's why I've been so open, not just with my breast cancer journey, but also more recently my fertility one. I'm 21 weeks pregnant with our first child, a girl, but getting here wasn't easy. We decided to go the route of in vitro fertilization, and I did 4 rounds of egg retrievals. I feel so lucky that we had excellent fertility coverage. Thank you, Washington Post and owner Jeff Bezos, for that. I'm also grateful that the technology exists for us to screen out the BRCA mutation in all of our embryos. So I know that our daughter will never have to confront the difficult decision I had to make at such a young age. And I've tried to pay that good luck forward by being open and honest with my experience, both with my colleagues at the PBS NewsHour and with the world, by writing and talking about it in public and sharing our journey on social media. And in fact, after the fertility gauntlet that we're going through, the next step I'm going to have to deal with is reducing my risk of ovarian cancer, because that's the other cancer that this gene raises the probability for. And so once we hopefully have 2 kids and all is well on that front, I will immediately have to remove my ovaries, because unfortunately there is no good protocol for early detection of ovarian cancer. And the advice right now for BRCA recipients like myself is to simply have your ovaries removed by the time you finish childbearing or by age 40, whichever comes first. And that'll put me into immediate menopause, which I'm not super excited about. But I will share and be open about it in the spirit of commiseration, and frankly, and a little cynically maybe, it helps build my brand as somebody who is open and honest, and hopefully that sense of honesty and openness carries into my reputation as a journalist. Like the woman of breast cancer like a boss, I firmly believe that being vulnerable in front of others ultimately serves us well. But in rereading these stories and sharing them with you today, it only reinforces that belief. Thank you so much. And I think I'd be happy to take some questions if anybody has them.
Thank you. You talked about all the experiences that you and other people like you had, and it seems like you are all professional women with pretty good access to health insurance and money. Mm-hmm. So I would like to know if you, if in your book or in your experience you saw the economic effects that this could cause for the majority of the people that are not professionals or with a lot of access to good health insurance.
Absolutely. It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I knew that in writing this book, talking about mainly professional and successful women was going to be a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I believed that they were the ones that were going to be able to share smart strategies as to how to personally get through something. However, on the flip side, they all had access to excellent health insurance and could choose providers that worked for them. They typically didn't deal with a lot of the issues that oftentimes prevent people from accessing good care, whether it's not living close to specialty care, not being able to pay for child care, not being able to take time off work because you don't work for somewhere that respects that. So to address that, number one, I do include in the back of the book many resources for people who are looking for ways to help pay for cancer treatment. I also spoke with an incredible woman named Molly McDowell, who she's from Michigan. She started a organization called Pink Fund. And there are many other groups like this. Hers just happens to be on a national scale, but there are many state-by-state funds that will provide microloans to help women who enter a cycle of financial toxicity as a result of a cancer diagnosis. And that can oftentimes be the most harmful financial implications for somebody going through breast cancer or any other cancer who may not have the financial wherewithal to fully support themselves, because typically, if you do have insurance, and of course that's leaving out a massive cohort of people, there are other social safety net programs that exist that I don't really get into in the book. But for the vast majority of people who are middle class and who may not be able to, for example, you might get your insurance, a payment plan that works for you, but what you won't get is the ability to, if you work for a company that doesn't have a very good medical leave policy, lots of people lose their jobs as a result of a cancer diagnosis. And so what groups like Pink Fund will do is help you provide microloans for whatever it is you need, whether it's to pay rent, whether it's to buy groceries, to make your car payments, because those are the types of things that once those start compounding, those can really set a person into a cycle of financial toxicity that affects their life in very real, visceral, daily ways. So certainly, this is not a book that gives a whole lot of experience from the perspective of the average cancer patient. That's absolutely true. That wasn't my intention, but I did try to address the reality that most people would not have access to the same resources that, you know, a Sheryl Crow might have, by including some of those anecdotes and also including resources in the back of the book.
Hi, Allie. Thank you for your talk. Is that gene always inherited, or can it be idiopathic? Do you know? Not inherited. And is it a test that all women should take? Is it a complex test?
I believe it's only inherited. I haven't heard of any cases where it's not. It's also prevalent among certain backgrounds. The Ashkenazi Jewish community is the largest cohort, but there are also higher occurrences within the Asian American community, and the Black community has ties to the BRCA gene, but also some other genes that unfortunately there is just not as much known about. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Is it a test that's about
Yes.
what you just said? Is it, well, maybe it's not necessary, but is it a complex test?
It's not a complex test. It is a blood test. However, interestingly, one of the Angelina effect, once she went public, was that lots of people were asking, should I get tested for this? And the answer is no. If you do not have either a family history of those two cancers, or you're not Ashkenazi Jewish, the recommendation is probably that you don't need to bother with this test. Interestingly, I know that places like Israel, where there's a high concentration of Ashkenazi Jews, I believe offers it on a compulsory basis if you want to take it. But for the most part, it's just not something that the vast majority of women or men, frankly, should worry about. There's plenty of other things to worry about. There's plenty of other cancers that are not affiliated with any mutation. And the concern is that, you know, it might open Pandora's box, and you might get people getting tested for this and that, even though they really have no elevated risk, and, you know, worry about other things.
I think we had one right here.
Thanks, Allie, for your honesty. I think it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Before I ask my question, I'm just going to answer about genetic testing. And you'll be pleased to know in our community, we've hired a genetic counselor at the Cancer Center. And so Laura's been there for 3 years. It took me 4 years to recruit that specialty.
Wow.
But to have a genetic panel run is, you know, opening Pandora's box. And many times your insurance will only pay for one lifetime panel. So really just, you know, go with your doctor's advice. So thank you. But I learned something new from your talk today. Didn't know that during the harvesting and the in vitro that you could glean out a BRCA gene. So that's really good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
What was my question? I think just getting that word out, what you're doing. The other thing is, to answer the other lady's question, is we have financial navigators, so we're almost to the point where every new cancer patient now will get the benefit of having their insurance reviewed. Des and I go way back of raising funds for the Cancer Center, and we have funds to help people not through their treatment to maybe pay their mortgage or their child care while they're going through treatment. So that is a goal every year that we do to raise for those that don't have the luxury of excellent health insurance.
Well, and if I may, you bring up a couple things that I'll just speak on quickly. First of all, having a genetic counselor in a community is so critical. They are an essential key between finding your results and finding out what that actually means. It's so important to have somebody who can go through that information with you in a responsible way. And in fact, as I alluded to, I found that my genetic counselor back in 2009 really did me a disservice in emphasizing one option and not another, which I think at the time she believed something that someone like me might consider too radical. I got a lot of questions at the time when I decided to have a preventative mastectomy. Aren't you so young? Don't you want to wait for the joys of breastfeeding? And don't you want to find a husband first? Which just are incredibly outdated and kind of really sexist. And so having a genetic counselor who who is well trained and can provide all the full complement of options is so essential. And then on the issue of pre-implantation genetic testing in IVF, I do think it's a relatively new phenomenon. I remember watching a piece on 60 Minutes, it's like 7 years ago about it, when it was just coming out. But it is such a blessing to be able to, choose to screen this out. And it wasn't necessarily something I did. We weren't initially going to go down the route of IVF, except for the fact that we were unable to get pregnant without assisted reproductive technology. And so I didn't necessarily come to it with a desire to make sure that a child of mine did not have the BRCA mutation, because, as I think I made clear, it's not a death sentence by any means. It's not a debilitating mutation. It's just something that is going to provide headaches at some point down the road. So it became an ancillary benefit when we did do IVF, and so it's a wonderful thought that we break the cycle.
Thanks, Allie. Appreciate your openness and your vulnerability and the stories you told us, and it makes me think about organizations and wondering how you're finding organizations are able to support women and men, anyone, but particularly women with cancer, because they have tended to kind of keep it private or hold it in or handle it on their own. And are there any trends you're seeing from some of the work you're doing or some of your friends that haven't had an impact, a positive impact on the organizations and the culture that's needed?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's happening on more of an anecdotal basis, unfortunately. It's not really happening as a cultural shift, at least. I've only worked in media, so I can really only speak to that, and I'm not aware of any broader trends. But what I will say is an encouraging step in at the NewsHour and at many other media companies is that they're doing more to extend the conversation to different affinity groups, whether that's young parents, women in the workplace, people of color, LGBTQ+, and those kinds of groups where people can feel a little more comfortable speaking about whatever challenge it is, be it health or otherwise, I think fosters better communication within the wider newsroom, in my case, and the wider workplace. So I don't necessarily think that I'm seeing a trend specifically with regard to health challenges, but I do think more organizations are becoming aware that it's not enough simply to foster a place that people are comfortable coming 9 to 5 and then leaving. They realize that a workplace should be a place where you feel comfortable being your whole self, and I think that's that's really healthy. I will say parenthetically that at my company a few years ago, an amazing colleague of mine who has since left, actually, but she was our rights and clearances lawyer, not having anything to do with healthcare policy, pursued a stronger parental leave policy that really paved the way for the rest of us. And whereas I think that may have been not taken seriously in maybe a previous year, in the year 2021 it was taken very seriously, and she was able to make that change. Well, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and really appreciate it.